Good morning, and we apologize for the short delay. I want to welcome all of you to this conference, America and China, the Next 30 Years. This year, we also celebrate the 60th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. So another way to look at the milestone is that we are now at the point where for half of the history of the People's Republic, there has been formal diplomatic relations with the United States. It is therefore an appropriate time to pause and reflect on the past and also think how to move forward into the future. I want to welcome all of you to the conference on behalf of Rice University and the Baker Institute for Public Policy. I'd like to extend a special thank you to Continental Airlines. It is appropriate that they are the key sponsor, not only because they are such great citizens of Houston, but they now provide the literal link between Houston and China. With the recent inauguration of their route from Newark to Shanghai, Houston is connected seamlessly to two of the great cities of China, and of course, more beyond. My only function here is to provide welcoming remarks, and given the speakers who follow, not merely their expertise, but their direct role and experience, I think wisdom counsels that I do not attempt to make very substantive remarks. I do want to thank Secretary Baker, the guiding spirit and inspiration of the Baker Institute and its honorary chair for being here, and a special thanks to Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who I won't go into all the details, but his dedication in finding his way here through turbulence in the middle of the night is deeply, deeply appreciated. And of course, to Ambassador Zhou, the representative of China to the United States. And I want to express special appreciation to Consul General Chao Hong. Houston was the first Chinese consulate established in the United States after the restoration of diplomatic relations, and today we have no doubt that it is still the best. Consul General Chao's energy and leadership were vital to this conference, but much more important, they served to link this city and our entire region to the People's Republic. We are very grateful for the role that you play. We also could not be more pleased to be partnering in this endeavor with the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies. This is another step in this partnership. We look forward to strengthening and deepening this relationship and participating in another conference with SIIS in Shanghai in 2010. We are honored to have that opportunity, recognizing what an important year that is for the city of Shanghai and the People's Republic. As I said, I will leave to the speakers who follow the substance of what the next 30 years looks like. I do want to briefly remark on the vital role that universities have played and will continue to play in this important bilateral relationship. From 1860 until 1950, a total of approximately 30,000 students from China studied in the United States. From 1950 until the early 1970s, very few did. But educational and scientific exchanges preceded the establishment of diplomatic relationships and indeed helped lay the foundation. Although our two countries had been isolated from each other for almost 3 decades, China scholars in the United States maintained contacts and knowledge that were essential. Now, over 80,000 Chinese students study in the United States each year. The number from the United States who go to China is unfortunately much smaller, about 11,000, but it is growing very rapidly, and in the last reported year alone increased by over 25%. It is now the 5th largest destination for American students studying abroad. Rice University has established increasing ties with China, and as a result, we are seeing ever more Chinese students here. Students from China constitute over 1/4 of the foreign students at Rice, by far the largest group. This past year, for the first time, Chinese students became the largest group of foreign students in our undergraduate program, surpassing both South Korea and Canada. In addition to our relationship with the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies, we are building relationships with universities across China, including, for example, Nankai, Tsinghua, Fudan, and Zhejiang. These relationships, which bring our bilateral relationship with China every day to our students and faculty, are one of the most important foundations for building a successful relationship between the United States and China over the next 30 years. Cooperation can only be built on understanding, and understanding is best achieved through education and experience. Universities have an obligation to foster such education and experience, and through this conference we seek to make an additional contribution. But much more important is what lies beyond, and we at Rice pledge to do our part to assure that the China-U.S. relationship remains productive in fostering the economic development and international security of our world. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce the Honorable James Baker, the 61st Secretary of State of the United States, the 67th Secretary of the Treasury, a man who continues to be of extraordinary service to our university, our nation, and our world.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you, President Liebran. Ladies and gentlemen, we actually kicked off this very important conference last evening by hosting a small dinner in honor of our out-of-town participants. Given their hectic day, though, and the fact that Dr. Kissinger's arrival in Houston was delayed by weather problems, we decided to move these remarks of mine to this morning. I want to repeat something I said last night, though. We are deeply honored by the presence of China's ambassador to the United States. We're delighted that you are here with us, sir, and by, of course, the presence of our keynote speaker, whom I will introduce further at the conclusion of my remarks. The topic of today's conference, China, America, and the next 30 years, could not be more timely nor more important. The 30th anniversary of the normalization of Sino-American diplomatic relations provides, I think, a unique opportunity both to assess past cooperation between our two countries and to discuss potential areas for future partnership. The stakes for China, for the United States, and for the world really could not be higher. Indeed, I would go so far as to say that forging a peaceful and productive Sino-American relationship may be the foremost geopolitical challenge confronting the world in the first half of the 21st century. And I think that the reason for that is quite simple. Despite our current financial problems, the United States remains the world's preeminent power in terms of economic output, military might, and diplomatic influence. China, given its extraordinary growth of the last quarter century, is poised to take an ever more important and active role in world affairs. And some people have seen this as a recipe for conflict. I couldn't disagree more fully. That's because I believe there exists vast scope for Sino-American cooperation across a broad range of important international issues, but only if we are wise enough to identify areas where our interests do converge, and there are a lot of those places, so let me just touch on a few of them. Both countries, for instance, have clear stakes in stability in the Middle East. Iran's nuclear program is just as clearly a threat to that stability, and not only would Tehran's acquisition of nuclear weapons raise the specter of heightened tensions in the world's most important energy-producing region, it would almost certainly prompt a regional arms race as other countries, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, perhaps even Egypt, sought their own nuclear weapons. Not least, any conflict associated with Iran's nuclear program, especially if it involved Israel, would play directly into the hands of Islamic extremists. Such outcomes are very plainly not in the interest of Beijing, Washington, or the capitals of the region. China and the United States also share an interest in strategic arms control. Given the size of American and Russian arsenals, however, reducing those arsenals is clearly, I think, an important first step. But any long-term effort must also engage China as a partner. Secretary Kissinger, along with George Shultz and Sam Nunn and Bill Perry, have articulated a goal or an aspiration of a world free of nuclear weapons, and I have endorsed that goal. We all realize, however, that achieving a world free of nuclear weapons will likely be a project of decades rather than just years. But I'm reminded in that regard of an anecdote that President Kennedy used to tell about the French Marshal Lyautey. The Marshal once asked his gardener to plant a tree. The gardener objected that the tree was slow growing and it would not reach maturity for 100 years. The Marshal replied, "Well, in that case, there's no time to lose. Plant it this afternoon." Global climate change is another area where Chinese and American interests converge. Our two countries lead the world in greenhouse gas emissions, comprising roughly 45% of the total. This means that any effort to address global climate change will fail if it does not include full participation by China and the United States of America. Let me be very clear. I do not for 1 minute underestimate the difficulties of crafting national and international regimes that both constrain greenhouse gas emissions and at the same time foster economic growth. But if Beijing and Washington are unprepared to provide leadership, believe me, ladies and gentlemen, no one else will. As major coal-producing and consuming countries, for instance, there is significant room for collaboration in developing and deploying cleaner coal technologies. Another related area rich with possible Sino-American cooperation is energy security. As a major oil importer, just like the United States, China now has a huge stake in the unimpeded flow of petroleum to the global economy at a reasonable price. The recent roller coaster ride in oil markets, which saw, as we all know, a 5-fold increase in prices before their collapse last year, has revealed the cost of volatility in terms of its impact on economic growth. Beijing and Washington need to work with other importing countries to craft policies ranging from coordinating stockpiling to encouraging diversity of supply that reduce instability in world petroleum markets. And not least, I think our two countries share a vast stake in a world economic order that is marked by openness and by stability and, of course, by growth. I don't have to tell anyone in this audience today that the global economy is in trouble, and it is in deep trouble. The full severity and scale and duration of today's crisis remains unknown, but two things I think are certain. First of all, we are today experiencing the greatest instability in world financial markets since World War II. And second, we are entering into a global recession that's going to leave few, if any, countries unscathed. The causes of these related crises are complicated, but a lion's share of the blame must surely fall on the political leaders, the regulators, and the bankers of major financial centers. Not only do Washington, London, Frankfurt, and Tokyo need to address the immediate risk of a financial meltdown, we must also reassess our entire approach to financial markets and begin the painstaking process of reforming the global financial system with emphasis on the principles of transparency, accountability, and prudent risk management. Whatever the causes of the current crisis, however, I think one lesson is paramount. Because of globalization, it is now impossible to address our economic and financial challenges without broad-based international cooperation and coordination. Going it alone is no longer an option, no matter the size or economic power of the country. Talk of a decoupling of the world economy that we've heard something about lately has turned out to be just that, talk. It's not going to happen in my view. In short, we are all in this mess together, and we're going to have to work together to get out of it. To reverse current economic trends is going to require unparalleled global coordination of fiscal, monetary, and regulatory policy. Any such effort, of course, must include China and the United States. and Washington will rightly continue to look to Beijing as a partner as we work together to craft a common international response. Above all, our two countries must avoid turning inward during a period of economic hardship and financial uncertainty. Protectionist rhetoric is already on the rise right here in the United States, and it will take courage for our leaders, from President Obama on down, to resist the temptation of politically popular but economically disastrous measures. If the world learned one thing, I think, from the Great Depression, it was surely the futility of beggar thy neighbor policies. The very last thing we should do during this current crisis is to make it worse by discouraging international trade and investment. We should take our lead from a dictum of the medical profession. First, do no harm. In the longer term, China and the United States must also work together to reduce destabilizing structural imbalances in the world economy. The United States, for its part, must reduce its federal deficit and encourage increases in savings. China, in turn, should build on its recent stimulus package to foster more robust domestic consumption. China's vast reserves of dollar-denominated assets, it should be recalled, are in many ways a symptom of our two countries' unhealthy imbalance of savings and consumption. I think the bottom line is this: Beijing and Washington are major stakeholders in a world economic system marked by the free flow of goods, services, and capital. And our task going forward has got to be to preserve the real benefits of globalization, and there are many, even as we work to curb its excesses. These are just a few of the areas, ladies and gentlemen, of common interest that exist between China and the United States. There are many others: combating terrorism, addressing North Korea's nuclear program, protecting international sea lanes from piracy, are just a few that come immediately to mind. But if we are to tackle any of them, we also need to manage the differences between the two countries. Those differences do exist. We need to admit that, as they do between all countries and between all great powers. And they're not going to go away immediately. At times of tension, we need to restrain the rhetoric on both sides of the Pacific. We need to keep lines of communication open. We need to find compromises that allow us to meet each other halfway. And sometimes we must simply agree to disagree and try to do that disagreement agreeably. Above all, we need to be realistic in our expectations, and we need to be pragmatic in our approach. What we cannot do is let our differences allow us to drift into conflict. It would be truly tragic were the world to emerge from one Cold War only to embark on another just 2 decades later. I'd like, if I might, to conclude on a personal note. I've been visiting China now, not for as long as our keynote speaker and honored guest, but I've been visiting China for over 30 years. And I never cease to be amazed by the immense strides that it has taken. Some observers say that China's economic performance during this period, one marked by hundreds of millions of individuals emerging from poverty, represents the greatest transformation in world economic history. From my own observation, I would simply have to agree with that. But China is not just richer. It is also more open and more confident and more optimistic. Cooperation between the United States and China has reached levels unimaginable when we first normalized relations 30 years ago. Who would have thought then, for instance, that Washington would one day be looking to Beijing as it worked to repair and reform the international financial system? But if cooperation between our governments has grown, so has contact between our two peoples. Thanks to an explosion of travel between the two countries, Americans and Chinese know and appreciate each other as never before. In short, it has been an astonishing 30 years for Sino-American relations, truly astonishing. And I'm confident, ladies and gentlemen, that the next 30 years can be similarly extraordinary. but only if Chinese and American leaders are wise enough to understand the opportunities that lie before us and brave enough to seize them. Thank you very, very much. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is a true privilege and pleasure for me to introduce our keynote speaker, who is, without doubt, one of the most influential public figures of the last half-century. From its inception, the Baker Institute has been dedicated to serving as a bridge between the world of ideas and the world of action. Our speaker embodies this ideal. He is both a thinker of astonishing intellectual breadth and a policymaker with a proven track record in dealing with some of the most difficult foreign policy issues that the United States has ever confronted. After a distinguished career on the faculty of Harvard's Department of Government, he entered government full-time in 1969 as National Security Advisor to President Richard Nixon. He was appointed Secretary of State in 1973, a position he held under both Presidents Nixon and President Ford. Our speaker's tenure in office was truly an extraordinary one. His accomplishments included face-to-face peace talks aimed at ending the Vietnam War, a feat for which he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973. He also pioneered détente with the Soviet Union, including arms control treaties between Washington and Moscow. Perhaps even more far-reaching, however, was our speaker's efforts to open a dialogue between the United States and the People's Republic of China. His 2 trips to Beijing in 1971, the first of them secret, laid the groundwork for President Nixon's visit the next year. That visit, which ended 23 years of Chinese isolation and Sino-American hostility, was truly historic in the fullest sense of the term. Our speaker's path-breaking efforts on China culminated 2 years after he left office, when Washington and Beijing established formal diplomatic ties. He will forever hold a place of distinction in the history of friendship between China and the United States. This makes his presence at today's conference a true honor, not just for the Baker Institute, but for all of us. Since leaving office in 1977, our speaker has remained deeply engaged in foreign policy, writing numerous books and commenting publicly on the key issues of the age. He continues to be an eloquent advocate for the importance of American engagement abroad, and he retains a very special interest in promoting Sino-American cooperation. Let me be very blunt. Our speaker has forgotten more about foreign policy than most self-described experts will ever know. It was a monumental effort for him to be here. He didn't arrive in Houston until 3:30 this morning. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in wholeheartedly welcoming back to the Baker Institute for the 3rd time my good friend and a real trooper, the Honorable Henry Kissinger.
Jim, ladies and gentlemen, it is always a privilege for me to speak to such a distinguished group and to my friends, the ambassador, the head of the Shanghai Institute. Over the 30-plus years of my relationship with China, I, of course, have formed so many ties of friendship and remember so many occasions in which this relationship was fostered. But I want to tell the Texas audience why I had to get down here, even at some inconvenience. I'm never sure what my friend Jim Baker is going to say about me unless I'm present to control him. You may not know how our friendship was formed. I had never heard of Jim Baker when I was Secretary of State. The first I heard of him, he made some unflattering comments about some agricultural policy that I've now forgotten, in which I was interested. And I said, who the hell is Jim Baker? He was, I think, an Assistant Secretary of Commerce at the time. Well, Jim Baker decided he'd show me who he was. Next thing I read is that Jim Baker is giving a speech in Denver during the presidential campaign, promising the faithful that they could safely vote for President Ford because he'd surely get rid of me as Secretary of State. So now I had to find out who he was. And I called him, and Jim said he had been quoted out of context. I've been spending 30 years plus trying to figure out in what context you can say. But since then, let me stress, there is no public figure for whom I have greater admiration and for whose views I have more respect than Jim Baker. And the reason I'm here is, of course, my devotion to Sino-American relations and my affection and admiration for Jim Baker. As long as I'm telling anecdotes, perhaps the Chinese ambassador will forgive me if I tell him what happened at a meeting between President Ford and Chairman Mao. President Ford made the same comment that Jim Baker made. He said to Chairman Mao, I always say, he said, people can disagree without being disagreeable. Of course, in Chinese, that makes no sense at all. So when Mao heard that, he said, Mr. President, why would you always say that? Because the word agree and disagreeable. So that was an exchange from that period. Now let me talk about Sino-American relations. First, I agree. We have not exchanged texts before. I agree with everything that Jim has said. He has outlined the key issues in our relationship and the challenge we have for the future. Let me sketch how this relationship developed and why it is so crucial for the future. When President Nixon came into office, there had been no diplomatic relations between China and the United States for nearly 30 years. It also turned out very difficult to find a venue with which to communicate. We, on our side, decided that it was urgent to begin communicating. One, because of the importance of China in the world. But also it was brought home to us because the Soviet Union at that time was concentrating over 40 divisions on the Chinese border. And President Nixon made the extraordinary decision that a country with which we had no diplomatic relations and that was vilifying us in its media was that its integrity was important to American security, and that we would make an effort to bring China into the international system and to discourage any effort to attack the independence and integrity of China. That was the key decision. Once that decision was made, the only problem was how we would establish the relationship. And both China and the United States had a little trouble at first. We tried to work through the Romanians. And we did that because we thought they were the most independent of the so-called satellite states. But the Chinese leadership didn't trust any of the satellite states. And so that channel did not work very effectively. Chairman Mao decided to reach us by giving an interview to an American journalist that we considered extremely left-wing. And he even put him next to him on the reviewing stand. But I must say, we didn't get the point, because we thought, of course, this left-wing journalist would stand next to Mao, and of course he would say these things. But this is just communist propaganda. So we didn't pay any adequate attention to the first communication. But finally we found a way through Pakistan. And I will not review all the mechanics, but the important thing was that from the beginning, the Chinese relationship with America was based on a recognition of the importance of the ties between these countries to the structure of the world. For one thing, there was nothing of the normal diplomatic material to work on. There was no trade whatsoever. One of the first measures we took was to permit American tourists to buy $100 worth of goods manufactured in China, in Hong Kong, no other place. That was our signal. This triggered some Russian experts in the State Department to come to the White House and say, if you go down this road, you are surely going to get into war with the Soviet Union, and you have to stop even taking one more step down that road. So, but there was no trade. There was no interaction. There was no educational exchange. So all we could talk about at the beginning was geopolitical and strategic issues. And if you read the dialogue of the first 2 or 3 years between American and Chinese leaders, they were philosophical disquisitions on the nature of the international system, how various countries fitted into it. And the purpose on both sides was to convey to the other that this was not just a tactical move, that we were not just basing this relationship on expediency, but that we on both sides had thought through the importance of this relationship to peace and progress in the world. Of course, none of us on the American side imagined what would happen in the development of China. Those of us who remember the China of the 1970s cannot imagine, could not have imagined what the China 30 years later would look like. I brought my son in 1974 to China, and I brought him back during the Olympics. And he didn't recognize anything in Beijing that he had remembered from the 70s, except, of course, the historic places. But he was stunned, as all of us have to be. It's a great economic achievement, but it is above all a tremendous tribute to the spirit and courage and dedication of the Chinese people. Only a people that had faith in its long history could undertake an enterprise that not only changed its economic system, but also had to reorient itself. And it could not know when it started how that would work. One of the most moving experiences of my life was in 1979. I had the privilege of being invited by Deng Xiaoping to a banquet at the Great Hall of the People. And I asked him a sort of a political science question, just for our table. I mean, how was he going to handle the balance between centralization and decentralization in China? And it's a historic problem in China. And he began to talk about his program. He had just returned to office a second time, and he began to talk in a fairly low voice to me, not to the others, to tell me what he was planning to do. I had never heard any of these ideas before, and it got very quiet in the room. And all the Chinese were sitting at the edge of their seats to hear what he was saying. I'll never forget this occasion, because then for the next 10 years, the Chinese did what he described, which was an act of faith at the time. And the Chinese have done this without foreign governmental assistance, by their own efforts and by the private cooperation of others, but not the governmental economic aid. It is one of the great achievements in history. Now, as we go through the decades, in the 70s, our relationship was based primarily on the attempt to achieve a strategic balance with the Soviet Union. That was the dominant theme of our relationship. And preventing what we called hegemony in the world. In the 80s, China began its reconstruction, but the Soviet Union was still an important factor. In the 90s, the Soviet Union collapsed. China began to become a powerful economic factor in the world. There were disputes, there were disagreements about the events of June '89 in Beijing and about the Taiwan Straits, but we overcame them. And by the end of the 90s, our two countries were focusing on the common tasks we had before us, which then continued after the turn of the century. So now we are in the situation that Jim has described. And I'd just like to add a few points to this. We now live in a unique period in human history. Never before has every part of the world been connected with every other part, or been affected by every other part. But we're also in a unique position in the sense that none of the major countries in the world now are in an adversarial relationship with any of the other major countries. There is no country in the world now that is threatening the system. The system is being threatened by non-state actors and by states, some of which are rogue states, but not by any major country. Therefore, the opportunity for the principal countries to work together is absolutely unprecedented. Secondly, we face the global crisis that Jim has described. It can only be solved cooperatively, and it can only be solved cooperatively if the United States and China work together closely and trustingly, and with a long-term point of view. One of the chief causes of the crisis is that the economic system of the world was permitted to run wild, while the political system remained confined primarily to national considerations. So there was no safety net for excesses in the economic field. So it is a responsibility of the United States and China to work together to create a new international financial system that prevents a repetition of these events. We are in addition, there is the issue, which Jim has also discussed, of nuclear proliferation. If we fail in this effort, some catastrophe somewhere down the road is inevitable. For those of us who had high office during the Cold War, the most wrenching decision was what we would do if we had to advise the president whether or not to use nuclear weapons. The consequences of the mass casualties of such a decision are now not imaginable for most people. As long as the number of nuclear powers was relatively small, this was a problem that could be handled by self-restraint. But as we look ahead in the 21st century, the problem of proliferation must be dealt with. And if Iran and North Korea emerge out of this situation with a stockpile of nuclear weapons, even if there were some negotiations on the way, that fact will demonstrate that the international community, and specifically China and the United States in the case of North Korea, were not able to bring about what is clearly in the interest of everybody, including the proliferating countries. So, but it is not just North Korea and Iran. The whole issue of proliferation needs the most thoughtful attention. Perhaps the most important task to consider is how the future of the Pacific region is going to develop. I think it is crucial that we develop some idea of a Pacific cooperative structure that enables China and the United States to work together in a larger framework. There are ideas of a G2. And of course, China and the United States must have close and frequent consultations. But their consultations will be much more meaningful to the rest of the world if they work together on a structure for the whole Pacific region. It is not in anybody's interest that on either side of the Pacific, a consciousness develops that there are two separate entities that are in global competition with each other. We have, of course, there are tasks that are specific to each region, but there are common challenges. And if the nations bordering the Pacific can develop some common definition of a common destiny, within that framework, China and the United States will always be crucial, play a crucial role. And so I would say that just as right after World War II, we developed, together with Atlantic nations, a notion of an Atlantic partnership. We now need a concept of a Pacific partnership. Of course, it's not a military alliance as it was then, but we have huge tasks in the economic field. We have important tasks in the educational field. One can imagine American universities creating campuses in China, and of course Chinese students are already coming in large numbers to the United States. In the next 30 years, we need, of course, to keep in mind issues of great concern to China, such as the relationship with Taiwan. And it is a tribute to both countries that they have managed to develop their contacts in the last generation on principles in which the United States firmly has put itself behind the idea of one China, behind the ideas of peaceful solution, but also of restraint. And one can note the progress that has been made in recent years in trade and in political contacts between Taiwan and the United States, something that should be continued to be supported. There's been no period in history where you could look at the world and say that it was possible to create a new international system of global significance. We are now in a period of recession, and so we are conscious of all the economic problems that we are facing. These problems will be overcome. But out of this period, everybody will draw certain conclusions. To some extent, countries will want to be free of the circumstances that brought this crisis about. But they have also learned that they cannot do it without cooperating more closely, and perhaps cooperating more closely with the country that they rightly blame, namely us, for some of the of these events. In the political world, we have before us a chance to solve the problems of proliferation, to deal with new issues that have never existed before, like environment and climate, that are truly global in nature. The element of energy security, in which the United States and China, as principal consumers, must have a common interest in assured supply and stabilization of prices. All of this requires close consultation between China and the United States. And one can only be very happy that when the two presidents met, they set up a framework which provides an opportunity to do this. In dialogues between China and the United States, there are, of course, some cultural problems. The Chinese approach is strategic, historic, long range. Ours tends to be more pragmatic. And so it is sometimes difficult to reconcile the way of thinking. But if the two sides meet regularly, if they set up the institutions that bring them together, not just on solving the problems of the moment, but of addressing the necessities of the future, then they can represent the dynamic element in bringing about a new international order. And the best one can hope is that in the next 30 years, progress is made comparable to the one that has been made in the last 30 years. So I want to tell the Chinese participants here that when we first came to China, we didn't think we would meet at an institute at Rice University to celebrate the rise of China, the partnership between China and the United States, not on strategic matters, but on building a new world order that brings about, that contributes to peace and progress. And Jim, I want to say how much you have done in all of these efforts and how much this institute contributes to the sort of dialogue that is essential for the future of our world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Secretary Kissinger. Because of the time constraints, we're not going to go immediately into a Q&A, and we'll see after our next keynote speaker's address if we will have time for that. It's now my honor to introduce Professor Yang Zhimian of the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies. Under Professor Yang's brilliant leadership, the SIIS has become and is noted and was ranked this year as one of the top global think tanks in the whole world. We at the Baker Institute have been truly honored to have now, in our brief history, a long history of collaboration and cooperation with SIIS, and we're looking forward, as David Liebman mentioned, to having another major conference in Shanghai and deepening our ties. So join me in introducing Professor Yang, who will now introduce our keynote speaker from China.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The best word for me to introduce Ambassador Zhou is he needs no introduction. But I'm introducing him, so I cannot use this word. But I can say I can introduce him without notes. In the past 60 years of the People's Republic of China, we were honored to have 4 generations of leadership. And Ambassador Zhou has been, in one way or another, had the linkage of the 4 generations of leaders. Almost at the same time when Dr. Henry Kissinger was visiting China secretly, Ambassador Zhou was a graduate from the Chinese University of Foreign Trade and Economic Cooperation, but he did not know at that time Premier Zhou Enlai already had a far-sightedness in selecting a small but brilliant group of young and diligent and intelligent students to study abroad. At that time, we could not send them to the Rice University, but to the London School of Economics and Politics. And the second generation of leadership was headed by Mr. Deng Xiaoping. And under him, Ambassador Zhou was one of the pioneering group to set up the first Chinese embassy here in Washington, D.C. And in many important occasions, Ambassador Zhou was the interpreter for Mr. Deng Xiaoping. So literally, he helped Deng Xiaoping to overcome the language barrier and, of course, to let the world know China much better. And under the third generation of the leadership headed by Mr. Jiang Zemin, Ambassador Zhou was one of the key persons in developing relations between our 2 countries, including the handling of the EP3 incidents. And now he was named by the 4th generation of leadership, President Hu Jintao, as the Chinese ambassador in Washington, D.C. And Ambassador Zhou used all his firmness to defend China's national interests while maintaining good relations with the United States, the government, and the people alike by his frankness and readiness to solve the problems. The Chinese names are more complicated than the Americans. Americans would say Peter, Tom, okay. But Ambassador Zhou's name is Wenzhong. If translated into English, it can be graceful and steadily. So shining or raining, thick or thin, Ambassador Zhou has always been in his graceful and steady manner to push forward China-US relations. Now, I have the honor to invite Ambassador Zhou to take the floor.
Thank you, President Yang, for a very kind introduction. And I really want to take this opportunity to thank President Yang and his institute for their remarkable work in promoting U.S.-China relations. And I look forward to still closer ties with between China and also the United States, between IIS and their counterparts here in this country. And I also want to thank Dr. Kissinger and Secretary Baker for their remarks. And I think their remarks have brought back many memories of the 30 years of our relations. And I also want to thank them for sharing with us their vision of the future. And I want to thank them for their leadership, their continued commitment to still better relations between our two countries. I hope they will keep giving us their very valuable advice. I also want to thank the university and the institute for giving me this opportunity to share this podium, to speak to this prestigious audience. So I will share with you some of my thoughts about the course we have traversed over the past 30 years. And I must say we have come a long way in our relations. So as a Chinese saying goes, the past, if not forgotten, serves as a guide for the future. When we try to envision China-US relations in the next 30 years, it is important to take a look at the path behind us, study the opportunities and challenges before us, and then explore ways to build a better tomorrow for China-US relations. In light of the theme of this conference, I want to share with you some of my personal views. First, the tremendous historical development of China-US relations is beyond the widest imagination of even the most optimistic prophet 30 years ago. My diplomatic career of mostly dealing with China-US relations started in late December 1978, when I came to work in Washington, D.C. The Sino-US Joint Communique on Establishing Diplomatic Relations was just issued, announcing the official establishment of diplomatic relations at the ambassadorial level on January 1, 1979. My colleagues and I worked at the Chinese Liaison Office, busy preparing for the opening of the Chinese Embassy. On March 1, 1979, the old Windsor Hotel officially became the Chinese Embassy. 30 years later, the new Chancery building of the Chinese Embassy, designed by I.M. Pei, is built in northwest Washington, D.C. It was fully put in use recently. The United States has also built a new embassy in Beijing. The new embassies symbolize a new chapter of China-US relations. After 30 years of development, China-US relationship has become one of the most dynamic and most influential bilateral relationships in the world. The following numbers offer a glimpse of the enormous change. In 1979, there was no high-level visit between our two countries except Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping's trip to the United States at the invitation of President Carter, which also took him to Houston. In recent years, the presidents of our two countries met several times a year and exchanged views frequently by phone and letters. President Hu Jintao and President Obama have already talked on the phone twice, and 2 days ago, they had their first meeting in London on the sideline of the G20 summit. and reached an important agreement on working together to build a positive, cooperative, and comprehensive China-US relationship for the 21st century. China and the United States have established more than 60 bilateral dialogue, consultation, and cooperation mechanisms. In light of the latest developments, the two governments have decided to integrate the China-US Strategic Economic Dialogue and the China-US Strategic Dialogue to establish a new mechanism, China-US Strategic and Economic Dialogue. The two sides will hold the first round of the dialogue in Washington, D.C. this summer. The trade between China and the United States was less than $2.5 billion at the time our two countries established diplomatic relations. By 2008, our trade has grown 130 times and exceeded $333 billion. There are 35 pairs of sister provinces and states, and 144 pairs of sister cities between China and the United States. In 2008, over 2.5 million people traveled between China and the United States. There are over 90,000 Chinese students in the United States and over 19,000 American students in China. Second, China and the United States have more shared interests, and China-US relationship has a stronger strategic foundation. President Nixon said during his visit to China in February 1972, "We were enemies. Today we have major differences. What has brought us together is the common interests that transcend the differences." Of all of us present here, I'm afraid only Dr. Kissinger had the privilege to witness that moment, and he knows better than anyone else the background and historical significance of his secret visit to China from January the 9th to 11th, 1971. In short, the most fundamental reason for the normalization of relations between China and the United States in early 1970s was a common security threat the two countries faced. Shared strategic interests pushed us to reach across the Pacific and put 25 years of mutual estrangement behind us. When the Cold War came to an end, some assumed that China-US relationship was at a crossroad. They were skeptical that this relationship would last. But the facts have proven that under the new international situation, China and the United States have found more shared strategic interests and broad areas for cooperation. Our two countries are partners in cooperation, not strategic rivals. Our relationship is a mutually beneficial and a win-win relationship rather than a zero-sum game. China-US cooperation is good for China, it is good for the United States, it is also good for Asia-Pacific region and the rest of the world. Right now, and for a period of time in the future, the shared interests of China and the United States are mainly reflected in the following aspects. First, maintain world peace and stability. China and the United States are permanent members of the UN Security Council and the world's biggest developing country and the biggest developed country, respectively. We shoulder major responsibilities for maintaining world peace and stability. Many international issues, such as counterterrorism and non-proliferation, and in many parts of the world, from the Korean Peninsula and Iran to Pakistan, Afghanistan, the Middle East, and Darfur of Sudan, China and the United States need to cooperate more closely. Second, promote sustainable global development. As to major economies of the world, China and the United States contribute over 30% of world economic growth, and therefore have significant impact on world economic stability and growth. The current financial and economic crisis has further highlighted the importance of maintaining the stability of Chinese and American economies. Our two countries have implemented large-scale stimulus plans, respectively, and have strengthened cooperation and dialogue on tackling the crisis. There are also broad prospects and enormous potential for us to work together to address energy, environment, and climate change issues, maintain the free trade system in the world, and bridge the North-South gap. The third, intensify bilateral economic cooperation and trade, strengthen the win-win structure, and bring tangible benefits to our peoples. The fourth, increase the friendship between our peoples and uphold world diversity. As colorful and multicultural nations, the Chinese and American peoples have a strong desire to know more about each other, and hence the increasingly vibrant and in-depth social and cultural exchanges. At the same time, it is important that we must commit ourselves to protecting the cultural identities of our countries and the diversity of the world in the spirit of harmony without uniformity, and seeking common grounds while putting aside differences. My third point is the grand of globalization calls for greater cooperation between China and the United States, and concerted efforts to tide over the current difficulties. Economic globalization is a prominent feature of our world today. The fact that the current financial and economic crisis started in one country and spread to every corner of the world highlighted the reality of a global village. Countries are interdependent and interests are intertwined to an unprecedented extent, forming a community of interests where it is not easy to tell our interests from yours. No country is immune against the crisis. As major players, China and the United States should work together and support each other in order to tide over the difficulties and walk out of the crisis as soon as possible. This will be our major contribution to the global efforts to stabilize the international financial market and realize worldwide economic recovery and growth. With globalization come global challenges from traditional and non-traditional security issues, such as counterterrorism, non-proliferation of WMD, and the regional hotspots, and other issues, including energy, environment, climate change, epidemic diseases, and natural disasters. These challenges call for greater consultation and cooperation and joint response from our two countries. Fourth, adhering to the principles of the three Sino-US joint communiques is crucial to the development of the bilateral relations. The three Sino-US joint communiques form the political basis of China-US relationship and provide guidelines to its development. At the center of the three joint communiques is the One China principle. Past experience tells us that to ensure smooth development of China-US relations, we must abide by the principles of the three joint communiques and handle the questions that bear on each other's core interests appropriately, such as the Taiwan question and Tibet-related matters, in order to minimize potential disruptions and harms to our bilateral relations. The question of Taiwan in particular bears on China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. It is where China's core interest lies. Right now, relations across the Taiwan Straits continue to improve and move along the track of peaceful development. We will continue to follow the principles of building mutual trust, laying aside disputes, seeking consensus, and shelving differences, and creating a win-win situation. Promote cross-strait dialogue and exchanges, and work to usher in a new phase of peaceful development of cross-strait relations. Despite many changes in the situation in the Taiwan Straits, the Chinese government will never waver in its adherence to the One China principle and will never compromise in its opposition to Taiwan independence, two Chinas, or one China, one Taiwan. It is hoped the U.S. government will honor its commitment, handle the Taiwan question prudently and appropriately, and support the peaceful development of cross-strait relations with real action. Fifth, China and the United States should strengthen exchanges, dialogue, and cooperation so as to provide continuous driving force for our bilateral relations. Despite the twists and turns in China-U.S. relations since the establishment of diplomatic relations, cooperation has always been the mainstream. To push for greater achievements in the next 30 years, both countries need to create new dynamism for the bilateral relations by increasing high-level exchanges and mutually beneficial cooperation in various fields. High-level exchanges have played an important and irreplaceable role in the development of China-U.S. relations. 70 days after the inauguration of the new U.S. administration, the presidents of our two countries have exchanged views over the phone and had their first face-to-face meeting. The Foreign Minister and the Secretary of State have exchanged successful visits. President Obama has accepted President Hu Jintao's invitation and is planning to visit China in the second half of this year. A few other important visits and exchanges are in the plan for the coming months. These efforts will provide important guarantee for the steady development of China-U.S. relations. At present, in addition to working together on the international financial crisis, China and the United States should enhance bilateral exchanges and cooperation in the fields of economy, trade, counterterrorism, law enforcement, male-to-male relations, science and technology, education, culture, health, and youth. We should also continue to step up consultation and dialogue on international and regional hotspot issues such as North Korea and Iran, and on United Nations affairs, and explore cooperation on energy, environment, and climate change issues. We need to open up our minds and explore new ways to vigorously encourage dialogue and exchanges between our legislatures, local governments, academic circles, business communities, and media groups so as to find more supporters and participants for China-U.S. relations. China and the United States differ in social system, historical and cultural background, and the level of development. It is only natural that we do not see eye to eye on certain issues. It is also normal that sometimes there are problems in our economic and trade ties, given the size, scope, and speed of our cooperation. The key to approaching our differences lies in mutual respect, equality, and addressing differences and problems through dialogues and consultations on an equal footing and in the spirit of seeking common grounds. Last but not least, both countries should always approach and manage China-U.S. relations from a strategic and long-term perspectives and keep the bilateral relations firmly on track. This is especially crucial. At a time of increased complexity and volatility in the international situation in the 21st century, our two great countries face increasing common challenges and should shoulder greater and shared responsibilities. It is more important than ever to ensure a healthy, stable, and growing China-U.S. relationship. China and the United States will both gain from peaceful coexistence and lose if they fall into conflict. President Obama told President Hu Jintao during their telephone conversation back in late January that the U.S. side was ready to develop more positive and more constructive relations with China. Secretary Hillary Clinton mentioned a new era of positive cooperation between China and the United States during her visit to China in February. As I said just now, President Hu and President Obama held their first meeting on April 1st in London, and agreed that the two sides will work together to build a positive, cooperative, and comprehensive China-US relationship for the 21st century. This is a strategic definition for the development of China-US relationship in the coming years. It is of important and profound significance. Ladies and gentlemen, anyone who knows the Chinese culture well must have heard this before. At 30, one stands firm. In life, 30 years of age is a crucial linchpin. For China-US relationship, 30 years of development has brought it to a new historical starting point. In the next 30 years, there will be major opportunities as well as challenges for China-US relationship. There will be sunny days, but the rains and the winds will be hardly avoidable. It is a common aspiration of the Chinese and American people, and it serves our fundamental interests to ensure long-term healthy and steady development of this bilateral relationship. I'm convinced that as long as both China and the United States carry on the good work, keep our bilateral relations firmly on track, strengthen dialogue, enhance mutual trust, expand cooperation, respond and accommodate each other's core interests, and meet various global challenges with joint efforts, we will surely be able to achieve long-term, healthy, and steady development of China-US relations in the coming months, in the next 30 years, and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Zhao. We don't have much time, and I have many questions here, but I'm going to ask our very distinguished keynote speakers one question each, and I'm going to urge them to answer briefly. Since we are at a university, Dr. Kissinger, and you are, despite all the high offices you have held in the government, known as a historian and a professor, I address this question to you from the audience. To what extent does memory of the unequal treaty system before 1949 influence the views of today's leaders of the People's Republic of China?
In order to understand the unequal treaties, one has to remember the historic role that China had played before that. China had conceived of itself, and correctly, as being the center of its universe and the definer of its ethical system, and not just of its political system. When the first British envoy was sent to China at the end of the 18th century, offering trade, the Chinese reply was, "You have nothing that we want, and we have nothing that you should want." So China thought of itself as a self-contained entity, which at that period produced 25% of the world's gross national product. Then, for a century, a series of treaties were made, which offended not only the national sovereignty of China, but the whole sense of itself, of China, as an entity that had persisted and grown and been the center of its universe for thousands of years. So anything that looks like a Western condescension to China is extremely offensive. And it is important in conducting relations with China to do it, as the ambassador pointed out, in a spirit of equality, reciprocity, and we also have to understand that this is the first time in history that China is entering a global international system. So we are both feeling our way towards a world that neither of our countries has had to deal with before, but in which the solution of the problems absolutely requires cooperation between our two countries. So the history that China has experienced in the 19th and early 20th century, it's very important to understand in Chinese reactions, in Chinese sensitivities on issues like Taiwan, for example, and in the Chinese perception of itself in the world.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kissinger. Secretary Baker, if you could put on your former Secretary of Treasury hat. What is the probability that China will continue buying U.S. Treasury bills if unemployment rises in China due to reductions in the manufacturing sector? Sure. What is the probability that China will continue buying U.S. Treasury bills if unemployment rises in China due to the reductions in the manufacturing sector?
Well, I think the chances are very good because I don't know where they're going to put their money otherwise. I don't see them putting it in drachma or even for that matter in yen, quite frankly. I think that for a long time, and this may be my bias as a former Treasury Secretary, I think that for a long time the dollar is going to remain the de facto reserve currency of the world. I've been saying publicly that it's going to remain the de facto reserve currency of the world for my lifetime and for the lifetime of a lot of people out there who are a lot younger than I am. And the reason for that is, I think, primarily the political stability that is offered by our system, and that in times of crisis, people flee to the dollar. If you've looked at what's happened since this economic downturn and decline began, the dollar has strengthened. Notwithstanding the suggestion from some quarters that all of this spending we're doing in order to get out of this mess is going to create inflation, which will result in a diminution of the dollar. So you see people rushing to the dollar, and quite frankly, China and the United States are the opposite sides of the coin of this issue we're dealing with. China is building up these tremendous reserves. We're creating these huge deficits, and as I said in my remarks, we got to get a handle. We got to do a better job of saving, and China has to do a better job of increasing domestic consumption and domestic demand. That's the solution to the problem. But given the size of China's foreign exchange reserves, there's no doubt in my mind that they're going to continue to have a substantial portion of those foreign exchange reserves in dollars.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary Baker. Ambassador Zhao, several questions on the possibilities of real collaboration and cooperation between U.S. and China over Middle East policy, where there are so many hotspots that you mentioned in your remarks, and both Secretaries Kissinger and Baker mentioned. But what do you see as the prospects of the United States and China truly beginning to collaborate in a constructive manner on issues like Pakistan, Iran, Arab-Israeli?
With regard to Pakistan, Afghanistan, I think we have sent one of our Vice Foreign Ministers to the meeting in Hague, which was held on March the 31st. And China also sent one of his Vice Foreign Ministers to the meeting held in Moscow on Afghanistan. So all along, China has been one of the players in seeking a settlement of the question of Afghanistan. And we are helping the government there to rebuild their country. And we have provided them with humanitarian aid and economic aid, and we will continue to do so. And so the special envoy appointed by the president will go to China. Ambassador Holbrooke will be in China in the middle of the month to hold consultations with Chinese counterparts. So I think we are working with all the parties relevant to this question including the United States, very closely, and I think we'll continue to do so. With regard to Iran, China is one of the 6, the P5+1 mechanism, and we have talked to Iran collectively, and China also is talking to Iran bilaterally. Of course, we share, this P5+1 share the same goal, that is Iran shall not possess nuclear weapons. And, but of course, it is important to get Iran to agree to that. So how to get there, and that's something we need to work out. And we hope the new policy, which is being sort of pursued by the new administration, will have some effect, we hope. And so we'll see. And as far as the question in the Middle East is concerned, China has appointed a new Middle East envoy, special envoy for the Middle East affairs. He has replaced his predecessor. So that shows China's continued effort for seeking a settlement of the Middle East.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, thank you for your superb presentations. You have certainly launched this very important conference on the 30th anniversary of our relationship. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking of our keynote speakers for their presentation.